The loudest silence is the one left behind by someone who finally stops saying yes. The warning bells echoed through Ashwood Fortress before the sun had fully cleared the distant mountains. Their deep bronze voices rolled across stone towers, empty courtyards, and frost-covered rooftops, calling every warrior to the eastern gate. Boots struck ancient cobblestones in hurried rhythm. Armor buckles clicked. Horses snorted into the cold morning air. Servants rushed through narrow hallways carrying blankets, medicine, and food for the soldiers preparing to leave before sunrise. Alpha King Ethan Ashford crossed the great hall without slowing his pace. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, wearing a dark ceremonial coat trimmed with silver, he carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed before speaking twice. Advisors followed several steps behind, reading lists of supplies and patrol reports, but Ethan barely listened. His thoughts rested on only one certainty. Claire would already be preparing the Luna Wing. She always did. She always anticipated what everyone else needed before they asked. As Ethan reached the carved oak doors leading into the Luna Wing, he pushed them open with calm confidence. Warm candlelight should have greeted him. The familiar scent of lavender tea should have drifted through the room. Fresh flowers should have rested beside the tall windows overlooking the valley. Instead, cold morning light spilled across an empty chamber. Every candle had burned out. The fireplace held only pale gray ash. The vases stood empty. The long wooden table where wounded soldiers usually found fresh bandages and warm meals had been carefully cleaned until it almost reflected the sunlight. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been disturbed. It looked less like someone had left in a hurry and more like someone had quietly finished a chapter of life before closing the final page. Ethan stopped walking. The silence inside the room felt strangely unfamiliar. His eyes slowly settled on the center of the table. A single silver Luna brooch rested there beside a neatly folded white ribbon. No letter. No explanation. No farewell. Just the symbol of her title, placed gently where it could not be missed. One of the younger guards stepped into the doorway behind him. "Your Majesty." Ethan did not answer immediately. He walked toward the table and picked up the brooch. The silver still held a trace of warmth from hands that could not have left very long ago. He looked around the room again. Claire's favorite rocking chair beside the fireplace remained perfectly aligned. The bookshelf had been dusted. Every blanket folded with impossible precision. Even the small ceramic cup she used for evening tea had been washed and placed upside down to dry. She had not abandoned the Luna Wing. She had said goodbye to it. Outside, another warning bell echoed across the fortress. Warriors gathered below the walls, waiting for orders before marching east. Ethan quietly slipped the brooch into his hand. "Where is Luna Claire?" he asked without turning around. The guard hesitated. "No one has seen her since before dawn, Your Majesty." Another servant appeared at the doorway, breathing quickly after searching every corridor. "Her attendants are gone as well. The guest rooms are empty. The medical supplies she personally organized are missing." Ethan's expression hardened, not with anger, but with disbelief. Claire had never missed a single departure. Through every harsh winter, every difficult harvest, every border conflict, she had always stood beside the eastern gate before the first horn sounded. She remembered every soldier's name. She handed warm bread to nervous recruits. She adjusted loose armor straps. She smiled at frightened children until they believed everything would somehow be all right. She had become as constant as sunrise itself. And now the room where that quiet kindness had lived stood perfectly still. Ethan walked toward the wide balcony overlooking the fortress below. Hundreds of warriors waited in disciplined lines. Stable hands guided horses through the mist. Smoke curled gently from distant chimneys. Everything looked exactly as it always had before a campaign. Yet something invisible had already changed. The fortress still had its king. It still had its walls. It still had its army. But the Luna Wing was empty, and for reasons Ethan could not yet explain, the entire fortress suddenly felt colder than the winter morning surrounding it. 3 days earlier, everything had seemed perfectly ordinary. 3 days earlier, Ashwood Fortress moved with the quiet rhythm that had defined generations. Morning sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting soft patterns across polished stone floors while the scent of fresh bread drifted from the castle kitchens. Servants crossed wide corridors carrying baskets of herbs, folded blankets, and steaming kettles of tea. Somewhere beyond the eastern walls, children laughed as they chased one another through the training courtyard before the day's lessons began. Claire Bennet walked through the fortress carrying a woven basket filled with clean bandages and jars of homemade salve. Her white dress disappeared beneath a simple gray cloak, making her almost indistinguishable from the castle healers. She greeted every person she passed with the same gentle smile. Stable hands smiled back. Elderly cooks thanked her for checking on their aching hands. Young apprentices hurried toward her whenever they scraped a knee or needed quiet encouragement before difficult tasks. Everyone called her Luna. Very few called her Claire. She stopped beside the nursery where several small children sat around a wooden table drawing pictures with pieces of colored chalk. One little girl proudly held up a page covered with flowers surrounding a large castle. "Look, Luna," she whispered. Claire knelt beside her until they were at eye level. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "Who lives here?" The child pointed toward a small figure standing outside the castle gate. "You do. You always wave goodbye when everyone leaves." Claire smiled warmly, though something quiet flickered behind her eyes before disappearing again. "Thank you," she replied. "I will treasure that." She carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into the basket beside the bandages. As she continued through the fortress, the familiar pattern repeated itself. A young guard asked whether extra blankets had arrived for the northern watchtower. Claire already knew where they had been stored. An elderly widow thanked her for arranging fresh firewood before the coming winter. Claire simply nodded. 2 exhausted healers discovered warm soup waiting outside the infirmary because someone had quietly remembered they had skipped lunch. No one saw her carrying the heavy pots through the hallway. They simply assumed the food had somehow appeared when it was needed most. By afternoon, the castle library filled with officers studying maps while advisors discussed supply routes for the coming campaign. Claire entered carrying a tray of fresh tea. Several commanders accepted the cups without looking away from the documents spread across the table. One quietly thanked the Luna before continuing his conversation about travel schedules and weather forecasts. Claire set the final cup beside Alpha King Ethan Ashford. He acknowledged it with a brief nod while reviewing reports brought by his council. The eastern villages received the additional grain shipments, one advisor reported. The medical wing is fully stocked, another added. Ethan looked over another page. Good. Claire stood there for another heartbeat, waiting as though expecting another question. None came. She quietly collected the empty tray and walked away without interrupting the meeting. From the far end of the hallway, the elderly housekeeper watched the exchange with thoughtful eyes. She had served 3 generations of the Ashford family and noticed small changes others overlooked. That evening she found Claire replacing wilted flowers inside the Luna wing. "You have not rested today," the older woman said gently. Claire smiled while arranging fresh white blossoms inside a simple glass vase. There was plenty to do. There is always plenty to do. The housekeeper hesitated before speaking again. "Does anyone ever ask who takes care of you?" Claire's hands became still for just a moment. She looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the tall windows where golden light stretched across the empty courtyard. A quiet breeze stirred the curtains. Somewhere below, another servant called for the Luna because a frightened child refused to sleep without hearing one of her stories. Claire gently adjusted the final flower before answering with the same calm smile she offered everyone else. "They need the Luna," she said softly. "I am not sure they remember there is also a woman named Claire." The following morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds that covered the mountains surrounding Ashwood Fortress. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows of the Luna wing as Claire Bennet quietly folded freshly washed blankets and placed them inside neatly labeled wooden cabinets. Every shelf stood perfectly organized. Every lantern had been filled with fresh oil. Every medicine bottle rested exactly where the healers expected to find it. She moved through the familiar rooms with calm precision, completing each small task without needing to think about it. It had become a language her hands spoke long before her mind caught up. Outside, the fortress gradually awakened to the sounds of preparation. Blacksmith hammers rang across the lower courtyard. Horses stamped against damp stone inside the stables. Messengers hurried through narrow streets carrying sealed orders between guard towers. The coming campaign occupied every conversation. Claire lifted a basket of dried herbs onto the central worktable just as the heavy wooden doors opened. Alpha King Ethan Ashford stepped inside without hesitation. His dark coat still carried traces of the morning mist, and folded maps rested beneath one arm. Claire looked up immediately and greeted him with the same gentle smile she had offered countless times before. "Good morning," she said softly. Ethan nodded once before placing the maps across the table. His eyes moved over supply lists already prepared in Claire's careful handwriting. "The healers are ready?" "Yes." "The medical wagons?" "Stocked before sunrise." "Emergency shelters?" "Finished yesterday afternoon." Ethan gave a brief approving nod. "Good." He unfolded another map and pointed toward a narrow valley marked with charcoal lines. "We leave at sunrise in 2 days. The eastern route will require every available healer. Prepare to travel with the front support teams." Claire remained silent for several seconds. The crackling fireplace filled the space between them while morning light slowly brightened the windows overlooking the valley. Ethan continued studying the map, already considering distances and supply schedules. He never noticed that Claire had not answered. Finally she asked one quiet question. "Do you need your Luna?" Ethan looked up. "Of course." Claire held his gaze with remarkable calm. "Or do you need another soldier?" The room became completely still. Even the fire seemed to settle into softer whispers. Ethan blinked, surprised not by the question itself but by hearing uncertainty in Claire's voice for the first time in years. He answered carefully, though his words came almost automatically. "Everyone has responsibilities." Claire lowered her eyes toward the map spread across the table. Tiny circles marked villages. Straight lines marked roads. Colored symbols represented food, medicine, and supplies. Every mark described people. Yet nowhere on the page did she see a place where someone had asked whether she wished to go. Ethan gently tapped one location with his finger. "The wounded will need experienced leadership. There is no one more qualified." Claire nodded slowly. "I understand." Her answer sounded warm, respectful, and completely sincere. Yet something invisible shifted inside the room. The elderly housekeeper paused outside the partially open door after hearing the conversation. She looked through the narrow opening and quietly watched Claire's face. There were no tears. No frustration. Only a peaceful expression that somehow felt more final than anger ever could. Ethan gathered the maps and prepared to leave. Before reaching the doorway, he paused. "Thank you," he said without turning around. "I knew I could count on you." Claire smiled gently. "You always could." Ethan walked into the hallway, already discussing travel plans with the captain waiting outside. Their voices gradually faded beneath the distant sounds of the busy fortress. Claire remained alone inside the Luna wing. She looked around the quiet room with slow, careful eyes, noticing every flower, every chair, every folded blanket she had arranged through years of faithful service. Then she reached into a small wooden drawer and quietly lifted the silver Luna brooch into the palm of her hand. Morning light settled across the polished metal, and for the first time in a very long while, Claire did not see a symbol of honor. She saw the weight of a life that no longer belonged to her. That evening, the first snow of the season drifted gently across Ashwood Fortress, covering rooftops and quiet gardens in a thin white blanket. Warm golden light spilled from every window while laughter echoed through the great hall where warriors gathered for their final meal before departure. Long wooden tables overflowed with fresh bread, roasted vegetables, steaming soup, and sweet cider. Music floated through the air as young musicians played familiar melodies that reminded everyone of home. Claire Bennett moved quietly among the crowded tables, filling empty cups, checking on elderly servants, and wrapping extra bread for children whose parents would leave at sunrise. Every smile she offered was genuine. Every kind word came naturally. No one noticed that she paused a little longer with each person than she usually did. It was as though she wanted to remember every face. One elderly blacksmith thanked her for repairing his wife's winter blanket. A young soldier nervously admitted this would be his first journey beyond the kingdom's borders. Claire placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and wished him a safe return. A little boy ran toward her carrying the drawing he had made the day before. "Will you still wave goodbye when everyone leaves?" he asked with innocent hope. Claire looked at the picture before carefully kneeling beside him. "Someone will always be there wishing you a safe journey," she answered softly. The child smiled, satisfied with the answer, and hurried back to his family. Claire watched him disappear into the crowd before quietly folding the drawing and slipping it inside her cloak. As the celebration continued, Alpha King Ethan Ashford stood with his commanders discussing patrol routes near the great fireplace. Every few minutes someone approached him with another report or another question. Claire looked toward him from across the hall. For a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan offered a small appreciative nod before returning to the conversation surrounding him. Claire smiled gently in return. It was the same warm smile she had given him countless times before. Yet tonight it carried a quiet peace that needed nothing in return. Later, after the musicians packed away their instruments and the last candles burned lower, Claire walked slowly through every hallway of the fortress. She straightened crooked picture frames, folded forgotten blankets, closed windows left open against the winter air. In the infirmary she quietly replaced several nearly empty medicine jars with fresh ones she had prepared earlier that week. In the nursery she tucked sleeping children beneath warm quilts and kissed the forehead of the little girl who had drawn the castle picture. The child smiled in her sleep without waking. Claire whispered, "Dream beautiful dreams." Near midnight she entered the Luna wing for what would become the final time. Moonlight poured through the tall windows, filling the room with silver light instead of candlelight. She removed fresh flowers from every vase and carried them outside to place beneath the old oak tree overlooking the valley. She washed her favorite teacup one last time and left it upside down beside the sink to dry. She folded every blanket with careful hands. Then she opened the wardrobe where elegant Luna robes hung in perfect order. One by one she brushed away invisible specks of dust before closing the doors forever. At last she stood before the polished wooden table in the center of the room. The silver Luna brooch rested quietly in her palm. She looked at its familiar shape for several long seconds before setting it gently upon the smooth surface. Beside it she placed the neatly folded white ribbon she had worn since the day she accepted the title. There was no farewell letter because she believed gratitude did not require explanation. There was no accusation because resentment had never found a home inside her heart. Only silence remained. Claire looked around the room one final time. Every corner reflected years of love freely given. Every object held memories that would always belong to this place. She smiled softly, not because leaving was easy, but because for the first time in many years, she was walking toward a life chosen by Claire instead of one expected from the Luna. Then she quietly closed the door behind her, and the gentle sound of the latch echoed through the empty wing like the final note of a song that had been beautiful from beginning to end. Dawn arrived beneath a sky the color of pale steel as the great gates of Ashwood Fortress slowly opened. Cold air rolled across the courtyard while the first rays of sunlight touched the snow-covered walls. Hundreds of warriors assembled in perfect formation, their cloaks stirring gently in the morning wind. Horses waited quietly beside supply wagons loaded through the night. The sound of leather straps tightening and wagon wheels settling against frozen stone blended into the calm rhythm of careful preparation. Alpha King Ethan Ashford stepped onto the eastern platform overlooking the gathered company. Every commander stood ready for departure. Every healer answered the morning roll call except one. Ethan looked toward the entrance leading from the Luna wing, expecting the familiar sight of Claire carrying medical ledgers beneath one arm and greeting every nervous recruit with that reassuring smile everyone had quietly come to depend on. The doorway remained empty. He waited another moment. Then another. The captain of the guard approached with a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, all divisions are prepared." Ethan nodded without taking his eyes from the empty entrance. "Where is Luna Claire?" The captain hesitated. "No one has reported seeing her this morning." Ethan frowned only slightly. "She is never late." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Nearby, several healers exchanged uncertain glances. One young apprentice quietly whispered, "She was here before everyone else yesterday." Another shook his head. "She always is." Ethan descended the stone steps and crossed the courtyard himself. As he walked, small details began to catch his attention in ways they never had before. The baskets of fresh bread usually waiting beside the departing wagons had already been delivered before sunrise, yet no one knew who had placed them there. Every medical crate had been packed with perfect organization, but none of the healers remembered seeing Claire complete the final inspection. Even the travel blankets folded inside the supply carts carried the neat stitching she always insisted upon. It was as though she had prepared everything for everyone except herself. Ethan reached the Luna wing and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The quiet room greeted him with cold morning light instead of warm candlelight. The fireplace had gone dark. The windows stood clean enough to reflect the snowy valley beyond the fortress walls. Fresh flowers no longer brightened the shelves. He slowly walked farther inside until his eyes settled upon the polished wooden table at the center of the room. The silver Luna brooch rested exactly where Claire had placed it. Beside it lay the neatly folded white ribbon. Nothing else. No letter explaining her decision. No request for forgiveness. No words of blame. Ethan picked up the brooch carefully, turning it over in his hand as though expecting some hidden message to appear. There was only silence. Behind him, the elderly housekeeper quietly entered the room. She looked toward the empty fireplace before speaking in a voice barely louder than the falling snow outside. "She cleaned everything before she left." Ethan did not answer. "She washed every blanket," the housekeeper continued softly. "Filled every medicine cabinet. Repaired every torn curtain. She even prepared meals for the healers to find today." Ethan slowly looked around the room again. Only now did he notice the impossible order. Nothing had been forgotten because Claire had remembered everything. The housekeeper stepped closer. She did not leave in anger. Ethan finally spoke. "Then why did she leave?" The older woman lowered her eyes. "Perhaps because everyone loved having a Luna." She paused before finishing the thought. Very few people remembered to love Claire. The words lingered inside the empty room long after she fell silent. Outside, the departure horn echoed across the fortress for the second time. Commanders waited. Wagons stood ready. Warriors looked toward the eastern gate expecting their king to lead them forward. Ethan remained motionless inside the silent Luna wing, holding nothing except a silver brooch that suddenly felt much heavier than any crown he had ever worn. The road east of Ashwood Fortress stretched across rolling hills covered in fresh snow, disappearing into quiet pine forests where morning sunlight filtered gently through towering branches. Supply wagons moved steadily along the frozen trail while horses exhaled soft clouds into the crisp winter air. Alpha King Ethan Ashford rode at the front of the column, yet his attention drifted far from maps and scouts. More than once his eyes turned toward the empty wagon that had always belonged to Claire Bennett. No one rode there now. The blankets remained perfectly folded exactly as she would have arranged them. The medicine chest stood neatly secured with fresh leather straps she had replaced only days earlier. It looked as though she had prepared the journey with great care while quietly deciding not to join it. Around midday the company stopped beside a shallow river to rest. Soldiers gathered around small cooking fires while healers unpacked supplies. Within minutes, confusion quietly spread through the camp. "Where are the extra herbs?" one healer asked. Another searched several wooden boxes before looking around uncertainly. Claire always remembered which remedies belonged together. A young apprentice held up a bundle of dried plants. "I know these help with fever, but I do not remember the correct mixture." The older healer smiled gently and answered, "Neither do I. Claire never allowed us to worry about it because she always prepared everything before we even asked." Ethan listened without speaking. He watched the healers studying handwritten labels attached to every container. The careful handwriting belonged to Claire. She had anticipated their needs once again, even after deciding to leave. Later that afternoon, a cold wind swept across the valley as the company resumed its journey. Snow began falling in slow, silent flakes that softened every sound except the steady rhythm of horses crossing the frozen road. Ethan pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. For years he had believed leadership meant seeing every threat before it arrived. Yet he had failed to notice the quiet loneliness growing inside someone who stood beside him every single day. That realization followed him more closely than any shadow. As evening approached, the company reached a small roadside shelter where travelers often rested before continuing through the mountain pass. Families from nearby villages had gathered there after leaving isolated farms ahead of the coming winter storms. Children sat beside simple stone fireplaces while elderly couples shared warm bread beneath heavy blankets. Ethan entered the shelter expecting little more than a brief stop before nightfall. Instead he noticed something familiar almost immediately. Every child held a knitted scarf in different colors. Every elderly traveler carried neatly wrapped packets of dried food labeled with careful handwriting. Fresh quilts covered every wooden bench. One little boy smiled proudly while showing his blanket to another child. "A kind lady gave this to my grandmother yesterday," he said. "She said everyone deserves to stay warm." Ethan slowly picked up one folded blanket resting nearby. The stitching running along its edges caught his attention. Every seam was perfectly even. Every corner folded exactly the same way. He had seen those careful stitches countless times inside Ashwood Fortress without ever truly noticing them. An elderly woman tending the fireplace looked up and smiled kindly. "Are you looking for the young healer?" Ethan's heart stirred unexpectedly. "You have seen her?" The woman nodded. "She arrived before sunrise yesterday. She brought blankets, medicine, warm bread, and enough supplies to help every traveler staying here. She never asked for payment." Ethan looked toward the quiet doorway leading back into the snowy evening. "Which direction did she go?" The woman gently added another log to the fire before answering. "North. Toward the old valley where families displaced by the winter have nowhere left to stay." She smiled softly as the flames reflected in her eyes. She did not speak much about herself. She only kept asking whether everyone had enough food before she continued walking. Ethan stood in thoughtful silence, still holding the carefully stitched blanket. For the first time since finding the empty Luna wing, he understood something that no report, no advisor, and no battlefield strategy could have revealed. Claire had not walked away from responsibility. She had simply chosen a responsibility no one else had been willing to see. The next morning, Ethan Ashford left the main column behind with only one trusted rider accompanying him through the northern valley. Fresh snow covered the narrow trail, muffling every hoofbeat until the world seemed wrapped in quiet stillness. Tall pine trees stood like silent guardians beneath a pale winter sky, their branches bending gently beneath layers of white. Cold air filled every breath, carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke from somewhere beyond the hills. Ethan followed the only signs he could find. Small footprints beside larger wagon tracks. Broken branches carefully cleared from the road. Tiny bundles of firewood stacked where weary travelers might need them. None of it looked accidental. Every gesture carried the same thoughtful care he had watched Claire practice for years inside Ashwood Fortress. As the trail curved around a frozen creek, voices drifted softly through the trees. They were not voices of soldiers preparing for battle. They were children laughing. Ethan slowed his horse and quietly approached the edge of a wide clearing. Before him stood several simple wooden cabins built around an old stone chapel that had long been abandoned. Thin ribbons of smoke rose peacefully from newly repaired chimneys. Fresh blankets hung drying beneath covered porches. Wooden benches surrounded small cooking fires where elderly men and women shared warm soup while children carried baskets of bread from one cabin to another. No banners marked the settlement. No guards patrolled the entrance. Yet the place felt safer than many castles Ethan had known. Near the center of the clearing, Claire Bennett knelt beside a young mother wrapping a clean bandage around the woman's injured wrist. Her gray cloak was dusted with snow, and loose strands of blonde hair caught the morning sunlight as she smiled with quiet reassurance. When the bandage was secure, she helped the woman stand before handing her a loaf of fresh bread. A little boy ran toward Claire carrying an armful of chopped firewood almost too heavy for him to manage. Claire laughed softly and accepted half the bundle before walking beside him toward the nearest cabin. She did not notice Ethan standing among the trees. She was too busy listening as the child excitedly explained how he had learned to split wood without wasting kindling. Ethan remained perfectly still. No one here called her Luna. One elderly woman thanked her by saying, "Claire, you have saved us another cold night." A young father smiled warmly. "Claire, the roof stayed dry through the storm exactly as you promised." Another child waved enthusiastically. "Miss Claire, come see the snowman we built." Every voice spoke her name, not her title. Every smile belonged to the woman rather than the position she once carried. Ethan quietly dismounted and walked forward. His boots crunched softly across the snow, finally drawing Claire's attention. She looked up. For one brief moment surprise crossed her face before settling into the same gentle smile she had always worn. It was calm. It was sincere. But it no longer carried the quiet exhaustion Ethan now realized had hidden behind it for years. Neither of them spoke immediately. Around them, life continued naturally. Children chased one another between cabins. Someone stirred soup inside a large iron pot. An elderly carpenter repaired a broken chair while humming a familiar tune. No one seemed frightened by the king's arrival. They simply continued caring for one another. Ethan slowly looked around the settlement. "You built all of this?" Claire shook her head gently. "No. They built it together." She glanced toward the families sharing breakfast beneath the winter sun. "I only helped them believe they still could." Ethan watched a young girl wrap an extra scarf around an older neighbor before running away laughing. He noticed a group of teenagers repairing another cabin while an elderly couple baked bread for everyone nearby. There was no wealth here. No grand walls. No royal ceremony. Yet every person seemed determined to carry a small part of someone else's burden. Claire stepped beside Ethan, her voice almost a whisper against the quiet wind. When people stop fighting to prove who matters most, they finally have enough strength to remember everyone matters. Ethan lowered his eyes, and for the first time since entering the empty Luna wing, he understood that Claire had not walked away from the kingdom. She had simply walked toward the people who had been waiting for someone to see them. The afternoon sun drifted lower behind the snow-covered mountains, bathing the quiet valley in warm amber light that reflected gently across the frozen creek. Smoke curled peacefully from the cabin chimneys while the comforting scent of fresh bread and pine wood lingered in the crisp winter air. Ethan Ashford remained standing beside Claire Bennett, watching the settlement continue its simple rhythm without anyone waiting for instructions. A teenage boy carried buckets of clean water to the elderly before anyone asked him. Two young sisters carefully folded blankets for families arriving before nightfall. An old carpenter quietly repaired a child's wooden chair while another villager prepared warm soup for strangers who had only reached the valley an hour earlier. No one seemed to be following orders. Everyone simply noticed what needed to be done. Ethan finally spoke. "How many people live here now?" Claire looked toward the cabins scattered across the clearing. 123 this week." Ethan turned toward her with quiet surprise. "You remember every number." Claire smiled softly. "I remember every person." Before Ethan could answer, a little girl hurried across the snow carrying a small basket almost as large as she was. She stopped beside Claire and proudly held it up. The last loaf came out perfectly. Claire looked inside the basket and laughed gently. It certainly did. She thanked the little girl before breaking the warm loaf into several smaller pieces and handing them to children gathered nearby. She kept none for herself. Ethan noticed the gesture immediately. You always give your portion away. Claire glanced toward the smiling children. They are still growing. A thoughtful silence settled between them. Ethan remembered dozens of evenings inside Ashwood Fortress when meals had simply appeared before every guest without anyone wondering who had quietly prepared them. He remembered warm blankets waiting beside fireplaces after long winter patrols. Fresh flowers on every windowsill. Medicine already organized before anyone requested it. For years he had accepted those quiet acts as though they belonged naturally to the castle itself. Standing here now, he finally understood they had always belonged to Claire. An elderly man slowly approached them, leaning on a carefully carved walking stick. He bowed respectfully toward Ethan before smiling warmly at Claire. The roof held through last night's snowfall, he said. Just as you promised. Claire's eyes brightened. I am glad you stayed warm. The old man looked toward Ethan. She arrived with almost nothing except hope and a wagon full of supplies. She never asked us who deserved help first. He paused before adding quietly, she only asked who had gone the longest without kindness. The words settled deeply inside Ethan's heart. He looked across the settlement once more. Every repaired cabin. Every warm fire. Every laughing child. Every peaceful face reflected a victory no battlefield could ever measure. Claire had not built an army. She had rebuilt trust. Ethan slowly reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed the silver Luna brooch he had carried since leaving Ashwood Fortress. The polished metal reflected the fading sunlight exactly as it had inside the empty Luna wing. He held it in both hands for several quiet moments before extending it toward Claire. This belongs to you, he said gently. Claire looked at the familiar symbol but did not reach for it. Instead, she slowly closed Ethan's fingers around the brooch once more. No, she answered with calm kindness. It belongs to the woman who still wishes to live that life. Ethan lowered his hand. There was no anger in her voice. No resentment. Only peaceful certainty. At that moment he realized she was not rejecting him. She was protecting the person she had finally become. A cold breeze moved softly through the valley, carrying the laughter of children across the snow. Claire turned as one little boy called her name from beside the chapel steps, asking if she could help him hang another lantern before sunset. She smiled warmly. I will be right there. Then she looked back at Ethan one last time. Titles can ask someone to serve forever, she said quietly. But love should never ask someone to disappear. Ethan watched her walk toward the waiting child, the golden evening light surrounding her with quiet warmth. For the first time in many years, he understood that the strongest person he had ever known had never carried a crown, a throne, or a title. She had simply carried other people until she finally remembered she deserved to be carried too. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight spilled gently across the northern valley, turning the fresh snow into fields of soft gold. Frost shimmered along the wooden fences surrounding the small settlement while smoke rose peacefully from every chimney. Children chased one another between the cabins with scarves trailing behind them like colorful ribbons. Elderly neighbors shared warm tea beneath the covered porch of the old chapel, and the quiet sound of hammers repairing another roof blended with birdsong returning after the long winter storm. Ethan Ashford stood beside his horse for several moments before walking back toward the center of the village. The silver Luna brooch still rested in the palm of his hand. It no longer felt like a symbol of honor. It felt like a reminder of everything he had failed to see while it was standing beside him every day. Claire Bennett emerged from one of the cabins carrying a basket filled with freshly baked bread. She smiled as several children hurried over to help carry the smaller loaves without being asked. Ethan watched them disappear toward the neighboring homes before stepping forward. Claire met his eyes with the same calm warmth that had always been there, but now it belonged entirely to herself. There was no expectation hidden behind it. No quiet exhaustion waiting to be ignored. Only peace. Ethan slowly walked to the old wooden table standing beside the chapel entrance. Without speaking, he placed the silver Luna brooch gently upon its weathered surface. The polished metal reflected the morning light for one brief moment before becoming still. Claire looked at the familiar symbol but made no movement toward it. Ethan finally broke the silence. I came here believing I had lost my Luna. He paused, looking across the valley where families were rebuilding ordinary lives together. Now I understand I had stopped seeing Claire long before she ever left. The quiet words drifted gently through the cold morning air. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. Thank you for saying my name. Ethan smiled sadly. I should have said it years ago. Neither of them reached for the brooch. Instead, they stood together as the village awakened around them. A young mother carried warm soup to an elderly neighbor. Two boys finished stacking firewood beside a widow's cabin before running off to help someone else. No one gave orders. No one waited for permission. Kindness simply moved from one person to another like sunlight passing through open windows. Ethan quietly removed the royal signet ring from one gloved hand and pressed it into the soft snow beside the table, leaving the clear impression of the ashwood crest. He looked at the mark for several thoughtful seconds before smoothing the snow flat again with his hand. Some things should leave an impression, he said softly. Not a weight. Claire understood exactly what he meant. Before returning to his horse, Ethan turned toward the gathered villagers. Ashwood Fortress will continue sending food, medicine, blankets, and building supplies throughout the winter, he announced. No taxes will ever be collected from this valley. No family here will owe the crown for accepting help. The villagers exchanged surprised smiles, but it was Claire who quietly nodded with gratitude. Ethan looked at her one final time. I am not asking you to come home. Claire answered with a gentle smile. Then perhaps one day we can simply visit each other. He nodded. I would like that. Without another word, Ethan mounted his horse and slowly rode back toward the southern road. Halfway across the snowy field, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Claire was kneeling beside the little girl who had once drawn a picture of a castle. Together they were planting tiny evergreen saplings along the edge of the village path, preparing for springs neither of them had seen yet. Ethan smiled quietly before turning forward again. The silver Luna brooch remained untouched on the wooden table beside the chapel, catching the morning sunlight without anyone claiming it. It no longer represented someone who had walked away. It represented a life freely returned. And as the valley slowly disappeared behind the snow-covered pines, Ethan finally understood a truth no throne could ever teach. A kingdom becomes stronger when people are loved for who they are, not only for what they are willing to sacrifice. Sometimes the kindest farewell is not the end of love. It is the beginning of finally seeing another human being as they have always deserved to be seen.